Thank you. My question's for Professor Apps. You talked about increasing female participation and getting women into the marketplace and out of the household. And I can see how clearly that would increase GDP, but do you think it would actually increase gross national happiness? And are people in fact possibly making reasonable decisions?
I think to answer that question, again, you need to look at the data, and what you find is that they're very miserable at the moment because they're having to pay huge childcare costs, and they're having to pay tax, and there's no access to childcare. Basically, what I'm arguing for is not for an incentive system which necessarily encourages women into the workforce. I'm arguing for a system that does not discriminate against them from entering the workforce. And the evidence, if you do cross-country comparisons using recent data for the European countries, what you find is that not only are the sorts of policies that we now have inhibiting the choices women can make, it's actually having a negative effect on fertility. So therefore, the answer to your question is purely on the basis of logic, yes, it will increase their happiness.
Thank you,
It will
Patricia.
increase their welfare.
Yeah, I think Quentin was the next question.
I asked a very tough question of John and Patricia. So how can we, or is it not possible to reconcile what you were saying, Patricia, and what John was saying in terms of GST, in terms of capital taxation? Are we diametrically opposed, or is there a way of, in terms of the evidence that's being used, in terms of
can I? Sorry.
Yes. You go first, Patricia, and then...
Even the US literature now is extremely worried about rising inequality. And you know what, there's some incredible statistic. 85 US citizens own something like the total wealth owned by whatever it was. I think it was cited in one of the G20 conferences. We can't just let that continue because it will undermine demand for the output of the economy. It simply will take us backwards. You're basically destroying the middle if you sort of continue with this extreme degree of inequality. And remember, a lot of it is due to market failure. So it would be more efficient to sort of either correct those problems with the legal system or whatever. I mean, look at the effects of CEO pay in the finance sector. So we really need to address these problems if we are to have a long-term sustainable economy.
John, I presume you'd like to come in now.
Look, I have no doubt that the inequality is increased by personal tax reform, in quotes, or changes in the last few years. I think in the 5 Howard tax packages, there's a significant redistribution in favour of the upper income groups, which compounded the measure of inequality. I think that's right. As far as consumption taxes go, I mean, I do think you can compensate for the impact of consumption taxes. And in fact, it provides you with the capacity in that compensation package to do even more. I mean, for example, what I tried in '93 was to say, well, there'd be a 10% of impact on pensions, but pensions are relatively low by a whole host of standards. Why don't we double pensions as a form of overcompensation? Not only to get political support, but to actually address a fundamental inequality in the system. And I think you can use the revenue from a GST to do that in a way that reduces some of the arguments about inequality.
Right, thanks, John. Hang on, there was a question down the front here first, and then I'll come to you, Terry.
Zhong Xiang from Fudan University. My question goes to John. You talk about the corporate tax reform, and those days there are a lot of sessions about how to make reform. And for example, if you reduce the corporate tax and change it to the environment tax, and if you keep revenue as neutral, basically you get out the positive outcome. So a lot of study done OECD, particularly European Commission, already proved that. But in your presentation, you specifically mentioned that there's shifting the corporate tax into the GST. Do you think the following scenario, for example, could it be that you completely, really depend on to what extent if you cut your corporate tax? Might be if you come to the extreme cases and very low and then make your Australia company become very competitive, produce a lot of stuff, but other hand, depress your real income and there's very little consumption. And in that you produce a lot of goods and actually people doesn't have money to buy, or at least because significant reduction in disposable income. End up that Australia flying somewhere to buy goods and, so in that maybe not good for economy as a whole. Maybe because you are in the middle of the ocean, probably this is not your concern, so I don't know.
I'm not sure I got the question, but my comments on corporate tax, I have an open mind on how you should reform corporate tax, including going as far as abolishing it altogether, as it's an intermediate tax and the incidence is passed on in one form or another, basically to individuals. I'm also very conscious of the fact that with mobile capital, the sort of system we have discriminates against investment, international investment in Australia, which we desperately need. As I said, I think imputation was a good idea when it was proposed in 1975, but by the time you got to 1985 or 1990, where our economy was dramatically more open and where capital was significantly more mobile, you might have been better to have cut the corporate tax rate and distributed the benefits that way. I do think it's worth thinking about the options there, from total abolition being replaced perhaps by some other form of tax, corporate expenditure tax perhaps, but I think a lot more work needs to be done to make some of those decisions.
Thanks, John. Terry, and then, in fact, why don't we take 3 questions now? We'll get Terry's first and then 2 here. Yep, sorry.
I'd just like to ask whether anyone here has really grasped the implications of automatic information exchange, because what is being asked for is the exchange of information of not just income but of assets. And I'm waiting for the first case where an American millionaire finds some child abducted by the Yakuza or the Russian mafia or something else and starts to sue the American government for compensation because information was given to some foreign tax agency and then bribed away. And that raises another question. The USA has pushed the FATCA agreement, but I doubt whether it can comply with it itself at its end, because it has a constitutional amendment which guarantees a right to privacy, and it cannot enforce the states to provide that information. For example, the state of Utah has not provided the Internal Revenue Service with registrations of LLCs in the past. So I'm wondering whether people really realise what's going on. I, for one, as an Australian citizen, was not very happy to get a notice from HSBC saying that they could give the details of my $53 in an unused cheque account to anyone from, starting with HMRC, we're still a British colony for them, down to Robert Mugabe and Kim Il-jung.
Okay, I'll let you ponder that question. We'll take 2 more. You might also figure out amongst yourselves who's going to answer that question.
I can make a comment.
Yeah, the front and then Richard. Sorry.
There's been a suggestion recently that the company tax rate should be reduced by 2%, not just the 1.5% under the Abbott paid parental leave scheme. And I just wonder whether this might be, whether the panel and Dr. Henry might think this is a sensible suggestion, given that it may make Australia a bit more attractive and combat profit shifting, along with giving the companies, big companies, a tax cut and not just simply compensate them for the levy.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
I'm interested in the issue around the political economy reform. A lot of discussion has been around Australia, but there may be particular models in overseas countries where they've actually gone through a consensus or build consensus process where they've actually successfully implemented a reform, a tax reform exercise. And I understand the OECD is looking at this more broadly, and recently they did work looking at the political economy reform in work, for example, making it happen. And they're thinking of rolling that out potentially in different areas of policy. So I'm just interested in the idea around models, and Professor Hewson mentioned the Tax Commission could potentially build up consensus that increases the probability of getting a decent tax reform going, but perhaps looking elsewhere in other countries where they've successfully done that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. Right, we'll have answers to those questions and we'll see how we go. Who would like to take the first question on exchange of information?
Can I make a couple of
good
comments?
on you.
I might make some comments on all of them while I've got that floor. So on automatic exchange of information, I think you're quite right that most taxpayers do not understand what the implications of that are for them as individuals or for companies. And although I'm of the view that from a revenue administration and government perspective, I'm supportive of these developments, I'm very conscious of the legitimacy problem and the credibility problem, and the fact that if the G20 agrees automatic exchange of information and Australia directly signs up to that with proper arrangements with Russia, for example, which is at the very bottom of the Transparency International corruption table or close to it, that there is a real risk, there is a real trust issue there about individual taxpayers in one jurisdiction and their income and assets and identity and so on being available to the governments of other jurisdictions. And I think that this is something we really haven't got a handle on, and it is actually something where something called the rule of law might need to be much more carefully built into these sort of transnational arrangements. So that would be my response on that. Can I just briefly, on the corporate tax rate, the corporate tax rates in the region are trending to 20% or lower. So I guess my kind of initial response would be, well, okay, 28.5%, 27%. It's not clear to me that if you're just looking at headline rates, that's going to make a difference. So I really think that sort of international competitiveness debate is highly superficial, and that's a potential problem in the debate. It's much more important to focus on the base, and also think that the internal corporate shareholder systems in each country play a very big role. So changing the corporate tax, as John said, it's an intermediary tax. Really, we're looking at burdens on underlying domestic investors, institutional funds and individuals who benefit from the imputation system, or foreign investors, foreign equity investment. It may be that we want to tax that at higher or lower rates, but we have to take all those further implications into account in thinking about that headline rate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Miranda. John, did you want to address the third question, or even, well, the second question as well? The second question was about the company tax rate 2% cut. Third question was really about the political economy of tax reform and successful models of engagement and so on. Do you want to address those?
I'll just make one comment on the corporate tax. I mean, the bottom line of international comparisons of corporate tax ends a race to the bottom.
Yeah.
And you don't want to be part of that. I think you want to make your decisions on principle.
Yeah.
Rather than participate in just narrow competitive competition in rates. In terms of workable models of tax reform, I guess if you went around, and I've only looked at a couple of others, but you run into the same sort of political difficulties. And that's one of the reasons why I think we should start at least contemplating the idea of taking the politics out of it, if you can, and having an independent authority responsible for doing that. It's a big step from where we are, and obviously you couldn't do it without a federation authority overseeing government spending at the three levels of government and attempting to eliminate duplication there. So now I think we have done a pretty good job in the past of thinking of these issues ourselves and designing our own political economy processes, and I think that's where it's got to go. I just think we need a way of cutting through it right now, which hasn't been there in the last 40 years, because in the end, at the end of the implementation process, and you can look at the Hawke-Keating package in '85, I mean, it was almost there, and then suddenly it was lost, and the compromise position in the end wasn't great as far as building a constituency for tax reform. The other question was on parental leave. Sorry, I didn't get the question.
Paper. Yeah.
Well, that's just that.
I mean, that's... how can I comment on that? It's politics, isn't it? I mean, you've got somebody committed to a paid parental leave scheme that is more generous than doing it at minimum wages and more generous than the Greens' $100,000 limit. Its limit's $150,000. You've got to have somewhere to pay for it when you're carrying on about debt and deficits. So you hit the corporate sector with a specific levy, which was done, of course, in relation to national disability too, in terms of the other government putting it on the Medicare levy. But those sort of issues will have to be rethought in terms of the aggregate tax reform of the corporate sector, if that's the way you're going to go.
Yeah. I think one thing we do have to ask ourselves, and you obviously share this view, John, is whether if we're going to have new social programs, whether it's paid parental leave or whether it's a national disability insurance scheme or whatever it is, what is the best means of financing those new schemes? Is it to rely on fiscal drag, which seems to be the present model, or is it to develop a specific levy targeted to the financing of that thing? I want to ask John a question, really, and I'm just going to ask you whether you agree with me, and I think the answer to this question is yes. I sense from your...
I don't agree with John on lots of things.
No, I'd suggest it pays to agree with you, Ken.
Yeah. I sensed in your presentation an element of frustration which I share. And in particular, you said that there was an urgent priority now associated with the need to develop a tax and transfer reform package. And my reaction to your question about the company tax rate cut of 2%, I actually find it difficult to respond to questions like that these days because I think it's such a small part of the system to focus on, It's not so small that it doesn't capture the imagination of the country's media for 24 hours. Very small things can do that. But it is so small that I just get frustrated even trying to think about it. And my sense, which I'm just asking you to confirm this, John, is that, we may... when we were working on the tax review, we had a sense that there were a set of challenges that the country was going to have to address over the next couple of decades or so. We did not identify a crisis for the Australian tax and transfer system. But I think we are getting closer to the point where we can say the crisis is imminent because so little progress, frankly, has been made in addressing those challenges. And I guess I'm just wanting you to nod your head at that.
Yeah, look, I entirely agree, and that's one of the reasons why I said what I said. I do think we are getting close to a position where it's fundamentally important now that we do actually fix it in a substantive way, and if politics are going to get in the way of that, we need to think of a way around that. I mean, one of the things that struck me, for example, taking your longer-term strategic point, we have a intergenerational report released at the time of a budget a few years ago. And the budget was delivered absolutely ignorant of anything that was said in that report. And that's been happening ever since. And so we talk about ageing, we talk about international mobile capital, we talk about climate change, all the big issues about which we draw a lot of attention. Then we go ahead and do whatever we need to do in the annual budget and move on.
Yeah, okay. Did any of the other speakers want to... Michael, did you want to come in?
Just a quick on the corporate tax stuff. I mean, Miranda's point and Ken's point that the rate is a small part of the picture is absolutely right. But it's a bigger issue than that. Locational decisions by firms, international locational decisions, when you look at the evidence, tax comes about 4 or 5 in the location choice. And where countries are really competing is actually around stability, quality of workforce, infrastructure. I mean, if you ask them, would you like to pay more or less tax, you know what they're going to say. But if you say to them, you're choosing between 3 or 4 jurisdictions, is tax a deal breaker? Most of them will say no. There are other factors that come in. When we talk about mobile capital, we have to think about those other factors, not just the rate, which is one part of the tax system, which is one part of the picture.
Okay. I'll take one more question from the audience before we break for afternoon tea, if there is another question. Right, you're one afternoon tea. Please. It's time. Well done.